David Quammen, benvenuto. David Quammen, saggista, divulgatore scientifico statunitense. Nel 2012, 10 anni fa, con Spillover, l'evoluzione delle pandemie, un libro realizzato sul campo attraverso lunghi viaggi e interviste a scienziati da e in tutto il mondo, ha raccontato l'evoluzione dei maggiori patogeni che hanno interessato la specie umana in seguito allo spillover, al salto di specie, anticipando clamorosamente quello che sarebbe stato la pandemia che ancora oggi stiamo vivendo e che tanto ha segnato la storia e le nostre vite. Dopo 10 anni esce con un nuovo libro, Senza respiro, ancora per Adelphi, una ricostruzione dei 3 anni che abbiamo trascorso dal punto di vista della scienza, ovvero di come la scienza abbia reagito di fronte a questa catastrofe, ancorché prevedibile, se non prevista, però abbia reagito in tempi veramente clamorosamente brevi. Allora, benvenuto, Mr. Quammen.
Grazie mille, Pietro. I'm delighted to be here with you at the Palace of Water.
Thank you very much. La prima domanda, Mr. Quammen. Uno dei temi fondamentali delle sue opere è il legame tra l'impatto delle attività umane sul pianeta e le pandemie. Deforestazione, perdita di biodiversità, viaggi, distruzione di habitat naturali, consumi insostenibili. Più attacchiamo e intacchiamo gli ecosistemi, più ci esponiamo a nuovi possibili virus, e non solo. Si direbbe una perfetta trappola evoluzionistica.
Well, it's true that there are 8 billion of us humans on this planet. We're hungry. We're hungry for food. We're hungry for meat. We're hungry for resources. We're hungry for minerals. We're hungry for wood. We're thirsty for water. And so we take all those things from the natural world, and we have a huge impact on the natural world. And when we take those things from the natural world, the rest of the natural world, we're part of the natural world, but when we take them from the rest of the natural world, when we take them from the aquifer, when we take them from diverse tropical forests, when we take them from anywhere, we cause impacts on the natural world that bring us closer to the viruses that live in those richly diverse ecosystems, among other things. The world is filled with viruses. All forms of animal, plant, fungus, bacteria carry their own viruses. So the more impact we have, the more we hunger for bringing resources toward us, the more we come in contact with wild animals in particular, and especially mammals and birds. And mammals and birds carry viruses, some of them that are capable of becoming human viruses. So that's what causes this increasing drumbeat of strange new diseases that's been going on now for 60 years. There's been an increasing drumbeat of new diseases, and COVID-19 is only the latest in a long series. And what they have in common is that we humans have largely brought these things on ourselves by our hunger and our thirst for resources, to satisfy our needs and our wants, our appetites. And it's going to continue. It's going to continue as long as we continue to expand our population and to treat the rest of the natural world as though it exists only to feed us. There are alternative futures. There are things we can do. We can talk about that.
Parliamone.
Well, first of all, the impact that we have is all a result of human population size multiplied by consumption. It's not just human population. It's population times consumption. And there are billions of people on this planet, unfortunately, who don't consume very much. And then there are those of us who are fortunate enough to live in affluent countries, in the wealthy countries, in the high-consuming countries, and we consume a lot. We consume a lot of meat, we consume a lot of oil, fossil fuels, we consume a lot of water, we consume more than our fair share. And we need to think about that. We need to change that. We also need to, in order to cause fewer spillovers, fewer occasions where a new virus passes from its non-human animal host into its first human and then infects a second human and a third human and pretty soon spreads around the world if we're very unlucky. We also need to do things that allow us to detect spillovers before they spread around the world. Surveillance, smart, active surveillance, so that we can detect these new viruses, particularly viruses, before they turn into global pandemics. And that's something that people are talking about. I've written about it just a little bit recently in the New York Times. It's the need for globalized, coordinated, smart surveillance to detect spillovers early and contain them. That should be one of the items on our agenda for planetary health and human health.
Il Covid ha colto tutti o quasi in realtà di sorpresa, rivelando una profonda impreparazione degli Stati di fronte a un'eventualità reale per quanto improbabile. Uno dei suoi quasi 100 interlocutori spiega che questa impreparazione è scaturita dalla mancanza di immaginazione. Tuttavia, ed è anche a questo che si riferisce il titolo del suo libro, la risposta della scienza è stata straordinaria, velocissima, sia nella ricerca delle cause, nella ricostruzione di quanto si immaginava, si è cercato di immaginare fosse avvenuto, sia nel conseguimento della soluzione, ovvero di un vaccino efficace.
Yeah, that's part of the solution, effective vaccines. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about surprise. Who was surprised by what? The scientists were not surprised by a novel virus getting a start in humans in Wuhan, China. They were not surprised by the fact that it was a coronavirus. And I wasn't surprised either, because they had told me 10 years ago that there was a pandemic coming and it would be caused by a virus. That virus would come out of a wild animal, possibly a bat. It would be a kind of virus that was capable of relatively fast mutation and fast change, fast adaptation, fast evolution. Therefore, probably either an influenza virus, a virus from the family that measles belongs to, or a coronavirus. And where would that happen? Well, it would happen somewhere where people come in contact with wild animals. For instance, a wet market in China. This was 10 years ago. So that wasn't surprising. Wasn't surprising to the disease scientists. Wasn't surprising to me. It was apparently surprising to some of our national leaders, but not because they hadn't heard it. The scientists had been warning about this very, very loudly in the scientific journals, the scientific literature. And the public health people, the people who run the public health agencies, the response to medical emergencies, it wasn't a surprise to them. They had heard what the scientists were saying. They had read what the scientists were saying. They knew that this was possible. It probably wasn't even a surprise to national leaders. Even, what was his name? Oh, an arrogant, ignorant man who was Donald Trump was our president at that time. I don't even think it was a surprise to him. What was a surprise was that it wouldn't go away magically. What was a surprise was that it cost trillions and tens of trillions of dollars. What was a surprise was that it made the stock market go down. What was a surprise was that it helped him lose his election. And it wasn't just Donald Trump. It was other national leaders. And as you mentioned, one of my scientific sources told me when I asked him about this, how did it happen that we were so unprepared? His name is Ali Khan. He's a wonderfully smart and witty but serious epidemiologist who I met almost 20 years ago when he was at the CDC, the American CDC, and now he is the dean of a school of public health in Nebraska. He said, David, I think it was lack of imagination. That was the problem. It wasn't lack of scientific research, it wasn't lack of information, it was lack of imagination. And I took that from him to mean that those national leaders were incapable of imagining how expensive it could be to them not to be prepared. They knew that to be prepared was expensive. It would cost tens of billions of dollars. It would require measures that would be unpopular, closing schools, closing economies, closing some airports, airport screening, some constraints on personal liberty for the good of everyone's welfare. Expensive in money and in political capital. The failure of imagination was a failure to imagine that the expense of not doing those things would be 1,000 times greater. That was the failure of imagination. The response of science has been brilliantly, effectively fast. For instance, with vaccines, not only with vaccines, but for instance with vaccines. And I talk about the race to vaccines in the book. I talk in particular about the the mRNA type of vaccine, messenger RNA type of vaccine, and that means the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. And I particularly tell the story of the Moderna vaccine race. I spoke with Dr. Fauci, I spoke with Tony Fauci about this. I spoke with Barney Graham, who was Tony Fauci's #1 vaccine research scientist at the Vaccine Research Center. I spoke with some of his collaborators, and they all told me that there was this sequence of actions that happened that began with the effort to get the sequence of the genome of the virus out to the public as soon as possible. And it was a breathless effort to get that out. It was sequenced in a lab of a scientist named Yongzhen Zhang in Shanghai, and he was working with a collaborator, a British fellow named Eddie Holmes at the University of Sydney in Australia. And Zhang and his colleagues had sequenced the virus at their lab in Shanghai, and Eddie Holmes persuaded them to release that, or to let him release that to the public. He did that on the morning, Sydney time and Shanghai time, the morning of January 11th, 2020. Finally, he got permission to put the sequence, 30,000 letters of DNA. It's an RNA genome, but it's converted to DNA for research because it's more stable. 30,000 letters of genome that went up on a website on the morning of January 11th, which was the evening of January 10th in Washington, D.C. and Bethesda, Maryland, where Tony Fauci and the Vaccine Research Center is located. They got the genome and immediately went to work on creating a vaccine based on that genome that would use the mRNA technology. Barney Graham called his people, said, "We've got the genome, it's time to go." Tony Fauci told him, "You just be ready. When we get the genome, I'll have the money, I'll support you, and you start." And they did that starting on the evening of January 10th, and within, I can't remember exactly, but it was roughly 60 days, the first experimental dose of that vaccine went into a human arm, and then within 9 months, there were production quantities of approved vaccine that I got in my arm and millions of other people got in their arms to begin the process of getting this pandemic under control. And never had vaccines been produced as quickly for a new virus as they were in this case. And it wasn't just the Moderna vaccine. It was also the Pfizer vaccine. In England, it was the AstraZeneca vaccine. All over the world, there were vaccine efforts in China, of course, and elsewhere. Scientists working breathlessly, which is again part of my title, reason for my title, to do this, and it was a great success story. Now we need to succeed at the second half of that particular effort, which is to persuade people who are resistant to vaccines to get the vaccine. That's one of the most serious problems we have right now, is a matter of education and persuasion to get people to agree to be vaccinated now that vaccines are becoming more and more available for everyone.
Di fronte alla pandemia, la risposta degli Stati, dopo francamente i primi tentennamenti e molti errori, è stata tuttavia profonda e radicale. Le persone in tutto il mondo si sono per lo più prestate a misure davvero straordinarie, inedite, molto faticose. Di fronte alla necessità sanitaria, ogni altro aspetto è passato in qualche modo in secondo piano, innanzitutto quello economico, ma anche quello delle relazioni interpersonali. Allora io mi chiedo perché in questa crisi c'è stata una risposta così forte, così corale, faticosa, ma condivisa, mentre per una crisi altrettanto seria, se non ben più grave come quella climatica, siamo ancora a un livello di inazione così clamoroso.
Yes, it is maddening that our reaction to the climate crisis is so, to make a pun, tepid. So slow, so reluctant. But it's not, in a sense, surprising. I'm sure other people have said this before, but it's like the frog in the pot. You put a frog in a pot of cool water and you turn the heat on underneath the pot and gradually increase the temperature of the water. And I've never tried this myself, but they say the frog will stay there and be boiled to death. But if you throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, the frog will hop out. Again, don't try this at home. Don't be cruel to frogs. Well, let's just take it as a metaphor. The climate crisis is causing terrible impacts, but not such immediate, drastic personal impacts. There aren't people around the world who are saying, I lost my mother in 2021 to climate change. She died of climate change in 2021. But there are people saying that about COVID-19. Many, many, many people. Climate change is gradual. Climate change is the frog in the pot of cool water, and that water is getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter now, and we're the frog. We're all the frog. It's not surprising, but we have to do something to break that cycle and to make that metaphor inapplicable in this case. It's COVID-19 has been dramatic. It started killing people from the very beginning. It's focused. You can say it's this virus. We have to deal with that. Climate change is more abstract, and it involves, like measures against COVID-19, it involves doing things that are inconvenient and unpleasant, things that we don't want to do. But with climate change, it's tragically easy for people to say, I'm not going to take it seriously now. Oh, science is still debating it. Oh, nobody in my family is going to die from it. At least not this year and maybe not next year. So it's very, very different kind of problem, equally serious, but there's an even greater failure of imagination that's going on with climate change. And to some degree we're all guilty of that.
Se guardiamo alla storia recente osserviamo che le pandemie, come peraltro ha detto, si sono intensificate. Allora, torniamo alle prossime pandemie, probabilmente anche più seria di questo, come ci ha spiegato. Nel libro parla di due diversi approcci che determinano strategie e investimenti futuri. Da una parte previsione e prevenzione e dall'altra sorveglianza e risposta.
Yes, there are two schools of thought about how to respond, as you say, prediction and prevention. Prediction, and that also includes discovery, viral discovery. And that implies the effort to go out and sample wild animals all over the planet to find the viruses that they carry, taking swabs, taking saliva swabs, taking fecal swabs, taking blood samples, looking in wildlife all over to find new viruses, and all wildlife carries viruses. Some of them carry viruses more likely to be dangerous to humans, mammals and birds. So you could say that there are, 1.5 million viruses just in mammals and birds that might infect humans. So let's go and look for those 1.5 million viruses and then see which ones look the most dangerous to us. That takes a lot of resources. That yields a lot of information. It is still difficult to predict which of those viruses you've found are the ones that are most likely to cause the next pandemic. You can make some predictions. You can say, as I said, that the viruses from mammals and birds are more likely to be the next human viruses. But which? 1.5 million? Maybe you could say the coronaviruses and the influenza viruses and the virus family that includes measles would be the most dangerous, which scientists do say. That would still give you a lot of viruses. The other school of thought, the other strategic approach is surveillance and response. And that means looking at the places and the situations where humans come in contact with wild animals and offer the opportunity for viruses to pass from wild animals into humans. So don't look everywhere in the forest. Look at the places where people are bringing monkeys into a market dead or live and selling them for food at the edge of a forest. Look at the markets in China, in Hong Kong, in Southeast Asia, where people are selling live chickens for food. And along with the live chickens, there are pangolins in cages, and there are bamboo rats in cages, and they're all stacked together. Go to those places and sample those animals. Don't go to the forest, go to these places. Sample those animals, take swabs, look for viruses. Take samples from the people who work there, the poultry workers, the people who have stalls selling chickens or selling bamboo rats. Persuade them to let you take swab samples of their saliva, or better still, blood samples, and look at their blood serum and see if they show evidence of having been exposed to a new virus. To see it, and the samples from the animals will tell you whether they're carrying new viruses. And then, having looked in those places, you might detect the next virus at a point when it has only infected one person. You might sample 30 people working in a live bird market and find one person who has antibodies against avian influenza in her blood. And that would tell you that avian influenza is there in those birds, and if it infected her, it might infect other people, and if it infected her and some other person, it might find a way to transmit from human to human, in which case you need to shut down that market and get rid of all those live birds and sterilize that place and pass regulations saying there should be no more live chickens sold in the same space as wild animals brought in live to be sold for food. That's the surveillance and response side. Again, it costs a lot of money. Do we do both? Do we have enough money to do both? Do we have enough resources of all sorts to do both? Depending on how you answer that question determines how you answer the next question, which is, if we only can afford one or the other, which do we do? And I have friends on both sides. But I'm inclined to think that the surveillance and response is the most important and the most cost-effective approach.
Sono passati ormai quasi 3 anni dall'inizio di questa storia faticosa e dolorosa. La pandemia ha lasciato ferite e ha portato a cambiamenti, forse definitivi, nella comunità umana. Ha probabilmente cambiato il nostro rapporto con la natura, spiegandoci peraltro come funziona l'evoluzione. Ha forse cambiato il nostro rapporto con gli altri esseri umani, di certo, ha modificato il nostro linguaggio, introducendo parole nuove ed espressioni che non usavamo, e ci ha fatto affrontare l'enorme problema delle fake news. ha anche rivoluzionato il mondo della ricerca, ha modificato anche il rapporto dei cittadini con la scienza?
Well, it has certainly challenged the world of scientific research, and it has changed it in some ways. For instance, it has speeded up the pace at which scientists share information. You've probably heard about preprints of scientific journal papers being put up on the internet, particular sites. There's a site called bioRxiv. There's a site called medRxiv. Those sites exist just to post essentially rough drafts of scientific journal papers before they have been reviewed by other scientists, before they have been subjected to criticism and correction. So preprints go up because scientists have been breathless in their desire to know what one another are doing, and society has been desperate for science to move quickly, to develop vaccines, to develop antivirals, to understand where this virus is going and what it's doing. So there's been a sharing of information and a sharing of misinformation at greater volume and greater speed than ever before. It's been coming because the internet at this point is not new. All of these things have been coming, but COVID-19 accelerated that change and drew on that change and magnified that change. And some of those preprints that were put up were very misleading, very wrong, very misguided. And then they came down because they were criticized, and the scientists who put them up, I suppose they were embarrassed that they had rushed to put up something as ignorant and misguided as some of these preprints. You know, this virus must have come from snakes. This virus was engineered from HIV. There were some crazy things that were put up, and they were put up by scientists who thought they knew what they were talking about, and they didn't. And other scientists made clear to them very quickly that they were embarrassing themselves, and they took those preprints down. But you still had newspaper headlines around the world saying, snake flu in China comes to Scotland. So that was problematic. So that's fake news in the scientific world. And then there's social media. There's Twitter in particular. Twitter played a big role during the first 2 years of COVID-19, first 2.5 years. And some of that role was good. Scientists were sharing thoughts on Twitter. There were threads of explanation. And some of it was bad. There were people putting fake news about the origins of the virus, all kinds of crazy suppositions and accusations, some very, very severe, unfounded accusations were being put up on Twitter, and that caused some scientists just to say, "Well, that's it. I'm going to disappear from Twitter because I'm getting death threats. People are saying I did this and I did that, and that's inaccurate. They're accusing me of this or that because of some circumstances that they found on the internet, some coincidences or whatever. They're putting together these conspiracy theories and these narratives that are not based on empirical evidence. So Twitter became a very feverish, that's the most polite word I can use, I suppose, a very feverish space. Now, as we're having this conversation, Elon Musk has just taken over Twitter, and who knows what's going to happen with Twitter next. Twitter could get worse, it could improve, and it could collapse. It could collapse. But the internet is not going to collapse, and if Twitter disappears, something else will take its place. I don't know how we deal with that problem. The problem of the pace at which disinformation as well as information is now shared. Science will continue because good professional scientists will continue to understand that their job is to gather empirical data and create hypotheses that fit the empirical data, and then look for more empirical data to test and to challenge their hypotheses. And then if the empirical data contradict their hypotheses, to change their hypotheses and correct what they're saying, and to listen to their colleagues. That's what science has always done, and science will continue to do that no matter what's going on social media. But in the meantime, the public has been very, very badly misinformed on a lot of things. And many members of the public have formed their strong convictions based on misinformation. Craziness going on. Certainly in my country, but I know my country is not the only one where this craziness is going on. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the people who think they know dark truths because they have spent an evening Googling on the internet, doing their research? How do we deal with that? In the immediate term, I don't know. I don't know how we change those people's minds. I don't think you can do it by arguing. I don't think you can do it even by showing evidence, because they will say, well, those are your facts, but here are my facts. I think that we have to do it by teaching the children in school better science, critical thinking. How do you teach critical thinking to a 12-year-old? I'm not a teacher. If I were a teacher, that would be the question that would be keeping me up at night. How do I do that? I got to figure out a way. I got to figure out a way to help these kids learn how to look at claims, assertions, stories on the internet and elsewhere, and ask themselves, is that real? I see it's printed on the internet, but that doesn't mean it's real. Is it real? What's the support for it? Who's it coming from? Who is this person? Who's this person behind the website? Is that a scientist, or is that some kid in his basement like me? I can't think of anything more important than for teachers to figure out ways they can help students learn critical thinking. God bless them.
Non credo ci sia maniera migliore di chiudere questa intervista. Grazie davvero David Quammen con il suo Senza Respiro. Thank you very much, David Quammen, for being here.
You're very welcome, Pietro. Very welcome. Grazie mille. Very, very great pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for having me.